In this video, I'm going to explain how to replace the subframe on the Tesla Model 3 and why. I already made a few videos about this in the past, but I figured it's about time to make a newer one. So the same procedure applies to replacing the rear motor, because you have to pretty much remove the whole subframe in order to do that. So first thing you want to do is remove everything in the bottom of the car. So the big plastic that protects the bottom of the motor, then to have access to these bolts. Then these fender liners, you don't really have to remove them, but it would help if you do. You got to remove this cover that covers the wires and the coolant lines to the motor. That cover needs to be removed. And then you're gonna have to disconnect these plugs on both sides that go to the rear subframe wiring harness. Then what you'd want to do is remove these calipers. There's two hex plus bolts holding each, and hang them like using zip ties is what I use, so that there's no weight on these lines. Make sure don't press the brake pedal while these are off, otherwise they're gonna compress and you're gonna have a hard time uncompressing them. Let's see, and then there's a ground. Basically 10 volt holding the ground wire to the subframe. You got to remove that. And then the four main bolts that hold the subframe. And actually, before you remove those, there's 13 millimeter bolts that hold these little brackets to the battery in the body. And these front bolts, these brackets, you got to remove those first. Of course, you got to support the subframe with some jacks before removing these bolts. Another thing that's probably worth doing before removing the bolts is, or maybe you can do that later, is remove these shocks. Before you remove the bolts, actually unscrew these two on each side, then lower the subframe, and then remove these shocks from the lower control arm, because it's going to be, if you don't have a lift, these shocks take up a lot of horizontal space. So remove them, then lower the subframe. Be careful with those springs. You might need, well, you will need two jacks to lower the subframe as one unit with these the rotors, the subframe, the axles, all of that. Remove that altogether. I usually, the last few times when I replaced subframes, I removed all of this from the subframe, all the suspension on each side, and then I would reinstall the new subframe and I would bolt it all together. But it's oftentimes tricky to get these on when the subframe is already on the car. Oftentimes it's easier to reassemble it when it's outside of the car still. So I recommend taking it all together as one unit, except the shocks. Oh, and then the wires, of course. You gotta disconnect the high voltage harness. Basically that cable, the orange cable, where it plugs into the battery, disconnect that. And then the coolant lines, there's two hoses. You gotta disconnect this hose here. That's gonna get lowered with the motor. And on the other side, there's a hose like this going into the PCS. Or you can remove it from the motor. That's actually what I usually do. I usually disconnect it from the motor right there, and then pull it out through this opening here, and it stays with the car. But I think I would recommend disconnecting from the PCS though. Oh, one more thing. Before you do all this, what you want to do is you need to enter into the service mode on the car and enter the procedure called coolant fill drain. You gotta run that first, ideally. You don't have to. You could purge the air later. It's just gonna take more work to purge the air later on if you don't enter that mode, supposedly. So then after you're gonna lower everything down, it's gonna look like this. And then it's pretty straightforward. You disconnect all those arms. You pull out the axles. I usually use a pry bar. This one is a little easier to remove. This one is a little more difficult. Oftentimes I end up bending this aluminum heat exchanger. So don't apply too much force. But yeah, those should come out pretty easily. And then the wiring is connected to the subframe on the bottom in these two sections. So there's one connection here on the bottom and one on the bottom there, and then you can remove the wiring. Everything else is pretty straightforward. And these are the sensors that go to the wheels, the speed sensors. And then there's 3 bolts holding the motor, the drive unit, to the subframe. And then you just need 2 people to lift up the motor, move it into the new subframe, reinstall the harness, reinstall the speed sensors, and then just yeah, all the suspension, assemble everything together other than these shocks, and then pull it under the car, lift it up with 2 jacks, or 3 jacks is even better if you have 3 jacks. Of course, use a lift if you have one, but I imagine most people watching my channel don't have a lift. So lift that up, then bolt up these 4 bolts, the main ones. Make sure it's aligned, of course, before you do that. And the ground, 10mm nut, the harness. These 2 is where it connects to the car. And of course the brakes. Put the brake calipers back on. Yeah, that should be pretty much it. Oh, and then before you put the wheels on and before you put on all the protective covers on, get the air out of the system, purge the air out, and make sure the contactors close and the car, you know, can charge and stuff like that. And then you can put the wheels on, put the covers on, and lower down the car. And as always, if this video was helpful to someone, please leave a comment, because I want to know that this actually helps some people around there. Otherwise, I don't want to be wasting my time making these videos. Thank you.